Hello guys, welcome back to the fifth and final screencast in the Getting Good with JavaScript screencast series. In this screencast series, we're going to learn how to use JavaScript in conjunction with HTML. Although JavaScript runs in pretty much every environment available today, most of the time you're going to be running it on a website and therefore in a browser, and therefore you're going to want to work with HTML. So that's what we're going to talk about for this whole chapter. And it sounds simple, doesn't it? I mean, HTML, right? But the tough part is the browser. Because the browser could mean Internet Explorer, or it could mean Firefox, or Google Chrome, or Safari, or Mobile Safari, or Opera, or really there are dozens of other browsers, hundreds. But there are at least 5 major browsers that you should try to support, or that you really need to support to be a good web developer. And not to mention, there are different versions of all of those. Well, who really cares about all this? Well, the point is that every web browser implements an interface by which you interact with the HTML elements that are on the page that your JavaScript's running on. Okay, before we even get that far, we got to talk about HTML text and how the browser reads it. So you write HTML, you've been doing it for years. But HTML is converted into a tree for the browser to understand. The browser takes the raw text and it converts it into a tree, and that's what it displays. So every element that you write is converted into a node. You can think of it as a family tree where each node is actually a person in the tree. The idea of a family is actually pretty relevant in the browser because you can think of how certain nodes can have siblings. Let me open our demo page here. And if we just have some HTML here, for example, let me just do something like this. Here I have an unordered list with 5 list items. The unordered list is the parent to all these list items. All of these list items are sibling nodes once it's converted into this tree format that the browser reads. So all these nodes are what makes up the browser. So that's one half of it. The other half of what the browser brings to the table is the functionality to access these nodes. And these two things together, the nodes and the ability to access them, are called the document object model, or the DOM for short. The problem here is that different browsers and different versions of different browsers are nowhere near harmonious in their implementation of these DOM standards, especially Internet Explorer. This makes it rather difficult to work with HTML elements because a lot of the time you have to check for a feature, make sure it's there, or do some workaround or something like that. It's just not fun. The other problem is that a lot of JavaScript developers don't really like the DOM interface that you have to work with JavaScript. It works okay, but it really could be a lot better. Anyway, it's what we have to work with. It's not going anywhere anytime soon, so we're going to have to learn to work with it. So, the truth is actually you don't have to learn to work with it. You could learn jQuery or MooTools or some other JavaScript library, and that's why all these JavaScript libraries work, because it's such a pain to actually have to use the DOM a lot of the time. But it's better to learn it the real way first, so let's learn it that way first. So let's talk about nodes again. So let me write a snippet of HTML out here. I'm going to say we're learning about the document object model or strong DOM. All right. So you're familiar with HTML. You've been doing this for years. So here's just a simple line of HTML. But how does the browser interpret this? Well, it turns it all into nodes, as we've said. So everything is a node. The tags are a node. The text is a node. If there were attributes on these elements, those would be nodes. Comments are nodes. Whitespace is nodes. So here's an example. This is what it would look like. Basically, this text that we have, that I've just written here, we have a paragraph node. That's the parent node. Any text that's in the paragraph node becomes a node of its own. The emphasis tag is a node, a child node of the paragraph node. The text or becomes a text node. Strong becomes another element node. And then the period becomes its own text node. The M node has a text node inside it. The strong node has a text node inside it. So you can see how this is a tree structure. So each element becomes a node. So how do we find these nodes on the page? Well, there are a number of ways to do this. First of all, let's talk about the document object is where pretty much every interaction with the DOM starts. And there are a number of methods that we can use to get elements. So the first one being get element by ID. Hopefully you can guess what this does. We pass an ID to this element, and it returns the HTML node that has the ID attribute of main. So for example, if we give this paragraph an ID attribute of main, and I were to console.log main, if I refresh this page, you can see right there, when I hover over this in the console, it's highlighted that paragraph in the body up here. So different browsers will display these HTML nodes in different ways in the console. Firefox is just doing it that way, which I think is a pretty nice, and whoops, did I just close? A nice and easy way to do it. Let me reopen what I accidentally just closed there. All right. So we can do it with get element by ID. We can also do it with class name. So I could say get elements by class name, and I could pass in a class name. For example, highlight or something like that, if that was a class name. I'm not going to show examples for all of these because you can guess how they work. But this is where the problems start. Get elements by class name is only supported, is not supported by Internet Explorer 6, 7, or 8. Now, this is unfortunate, but this is also where JavaScript really shines, because it's pretty easy, if you're familiar with the cross-browser DOM idiosyncrasies, to create your own get elements by class name function. It's going to be a bit complex for you at this point, but I've included a link to an article by the creator of jQuery, John Resig, where he talks about a couple of different ways of creating the get elements by class name function from scratch for browsers that don't support it. You may have trouble understanding it at this point with your current knowledge, but give it a try, and at the very least you can use his code in your own projects if necessary. So besides get elements by class name, there's get elements by tag name, where you pass a tag name and it will return an array of all the elements on that page with the tags. Notice that get elements by tag name and get elements by class name, both are plural get elements, whereas get element by ID was singular element and it returned a single element. Get elements by tag name and get elements by class name both return an array. Okay, so those are the basic ways you're going to be getting elements. But once you find an element, you're often going to want to traverse the DOM. To traverse the DOM basically means to move down the DOM structure. So let's say we have div here with the class of product, right? We could have a bunch of products on a page. We could have an h2 with the product name. We could have an image with a picture. And then we could have a description of the product, just like that. Right? So we'll have something like that. So let's say we have a dozen or so of those on the page and we want to get all the h2s. So what we're going to do is find all of the divs with a class of product, and then we're going to get those h2s within them. Because although we could just say get all the h2 elements, let's say there are h2 elements that are outside of divs with the class product, and we only want to get all the ones that have product names. This is going to require some skills in traversing the DOM. So before we actually do that, let's go back to that idea of trees. When we have a tree, let's bring up this image here. The way it works is that every parent node has a link to its first child. Every child node has a link to its siblings. It's both its next sibling and its previous sibling. I'm only showing the forward arrows here, but it also has a link to the previous siblings. And they also have a link to their first child. So these are one-way links for the most part. Every parent does not have a link to all of its children, just its first child, and then you can use next sibling to go along until you find the parent or the child you want. I should mention that every child does have a link to its parent element. All right, so now let's move back to our scenario. This is, as you can see here, a simple drawing of our div with a class of product node structure here. The problem is that what I've drawn here isn't completely accurate. The h2 is not the first child of the div.product. And why is it not the first child? Well, because there's white space between the opening product div tag and the opening h2 tag, and white space is captured in its own element. So what we have to do is jump over that white space, and if you're going to be doing much manipulation of the DOM yourself like this, you're going to be finding that you have to jump over a lot of white space. So what's the plan here? How do we work around all these white space nodes? For example, here's a blank white space node between it there. And actually, let me see if I can show you this. So let's do, we'll say var product equals a document.get elements by class name. I can use this because Firefox does support class name. We're looking for the div with a class of product, or was it products? Product. Very good. We're just going to get, because that returns an array, I can just say get the first item in the array, like that. So now let's say console.log product, just like that. So now if I refresh this page, you can see we have that div product there. If I click on this, it takes us to it in the HTML tab. Instead, I want to go view it in the DOM tab, which just gives us a list of all the properties that this element has. So right down here, look, here's first child. Notice the first child is a text node. So it's not actually the h2. The first child is the text node. We're going to discuss first child in a second here, but just know that the first child is the text node. So thankfully, though, there's an easy way to figure out what type of node we're looking at a time. And that is with every node has the node type property. If a node type property is 1, we know it's an HTML element. If the node type property is 2, we know it's an HTML element attribute. If it is 3, we know it's a text node. If it is 8, we know it's a comment node. And if it is 9, we know it is the document object itself. So to find the h2, we have to find the first child of the div node. Then we have to check its node type to see if it's 1. If it is not 1, we have to get its next sibling and check to see if its node is 1. And then we have to, node type is 1. We have to keep going until we find the first node that has a node type of 1. Hopefully I haven't lost you here. So let's assume there are more than one product element on a page. In fact, let me do this. I'll just, I'll just copy those and paste them twice more so we have a few. So we'll say products equal document.get elements by class name of product. And then let's say I equals 0, and we do want to have a child variable as well. So here's what we have to do. For, well, I is less than products dot length I++. So we're going to loop over each product, and what we have to do is set the child variable equal to products I dot first child. So that's how we access the first child. It's just with the first child property. So now child equals the first child. So now what we're going to do is say while child dot node type is not equal to 1, we're going to set child equals to child dot next sibling. So think about what we're doing here. If I reopen this, so for every div that with a class of product that we have in the for loop here, for each one, we set child equal to the first child. Assume this points to a white space node, a text node over here that has no text in it. It's just blank space. So that's what child equals. And while the child's node type is not equal to 1, so in this case it's not, we set child equal to child's next sibling. In this case, it's going to find that right away in the H2. And then so what we'll do is after we find the right child down here, we'll just say console.log child, just like that. So now if I come here to the console panel and I refresh this, you'll notice we have 3 H2s, product name, product name, product name. So we were able to find the H2s because when it found the first child node that had a node type of 1, we knew that that would be our H2. Those are the basics of traversing the DOM, but there are a few more links between nodes that we should talk about before we conclude this node traversing session. So let's look at those here. The first one is child nodes as an array. So let me do this. I'll just delete this all here. I'm just going to create node is going to equal document dot get element by ID. We'll call it main. Let's keep this here. Let's delete this. So let's say we have an unordered list with an ID of main, and we have 3 list items. I'm just using the SparkUp plugin. 3 list items which will have A, B, and C as the text. Very good. So what we can do, let's console.log main. So what did I say? Child nodes. Child nodes is a property that's actually an array. If I refresh this page here, you'll see that we get an array here of all the child nodes that our unordered list has. You can see here we have a text node, a list item, a text node, a list item, a text node, a list item, and a text node. Those are all the child items, all the child nodes that our list item has, and you can access child nodes via the child nodes in that way. There's another one, children. Let's see how this differs from child nodes. Notice what happened. The children property is an array of only the HTML element nodes, which could be very useful. So an easier way to get the first child node would have been, instead of manipulating the DOM as we did before, would be to get children 0. However, I should warn you that IE6, IE7, and IE8 include comment nodes in the children array for some reason, so you'll want to be aware of that. There's also last child. We talked about first child. Last child is the same thing, except it's the last child instead of the first child. If I say, let me do this. Let me just, I'm going to put a paragraph here that says before the list, and a paragraph here that says after the list. Now, we also have a previous sibling. Previous sibling returns us the sibling the sibling node previous to the element we have. So we have main.previous sibling is its link to its previous sibling. Now I've just added this paragraph here. Remember though, there's going to be a text node between these two because of the line break I have. And so we're not going to get this paragraph as the actual previous sibling. If I refresh this, you can see indeed the previous sibling is a text node. This matches right with the next sibling one that we saw in our traversal example. Next sibling is also as a text node, which we can't really see. What else do we have here? We have main, we can do parent node. That's useful, which is a link that points back up to its parent. In this case, the body is going to be the parent of the unordered list. Let's see if that's what we get. Yes, we get our body element here as the parent of the unordered list element. That's good. What are a few others that we have? Well, there's first element child. These are not supported by IE6, 7, or 8, or Firefox 3. They are supported in IE9 and Firefox 3.5 and up. I'm running Firefox 4 here, and actually just today Firefox 5 has been released, but I don't believe it's a huge upgrade. So we have main.first element child, and you'll see that that is indeed the first list element instead of a text node. We also have last element child, which in this case is our C list element. And besides first and last element child, we have next element sibling. Instead of just next sibling, we have next element sibling, which in this case is the after the list paragraph. And we also have previous element sibling, which is the before the paragraph, or before the list paragraph. Both previous element sibling and next element sibling also are not supported by IE6, 7, and 8 or Firefox 3. So there's a bit of DOM traversal for you. Let's now talk about adding, removing, and modifying elements that are in the DOM. There's more to finding just the right DOM node. Often you'll want to add something. But when you boil it down to everything you might want to do that changes the DOM, you can either change the existing DOM tree by adding, removing, or shuffling nodes, or you can change the information surrounding a given node or set of nodes. The information that you're changing there could be the style of the node, it could be events, which we'll talk about soon, or it could be attributes, things like that. So for now, let's talk about changing the DOM nodes themselves. So first, let's talk about creating nodes. Well, we can create a node. Let's say create a variable here called a new node by just saying document.create element, and we pass it the tag name. In this case, it's paragraph. We can also create a text node. I'll just call this new text with document.create text node. This is some text, we'll say. So now we've created an element, we've created a text node. Now we want to put them together and put them in the DOM. So we can do this with append child. Now, before we get there though, think about how we want to insert something into a tree. When we insert a tree into the DOM, let's bring this up, our picture here, actually let's bring up our other one here. In computer science, you'll study a lot about trees, and you'll know if you've studied computer science that when you're inserting a node into a tree, we could insert it into one of two places. We can either insert it as the last child of a given node. So for example, we can insert it as the last child of this paragraph element, or we can insert it as the previous sibling to a given node. So it can either be the last element of this paragraph, or it could be the previous sibling to any one of these current child nodes of the paragraph. So those are the two ways to think about it: last child element of a given node, or the previous sibling node of a given node. And that's the way we can insert nodes into the DOM as well. So the first way would be to append child. When we say append child, that means put this as the new last child of a given element. So we can say new node dot append child new text. And we've just appended this text node that we created is now the only node inside new node, but it's the last node because even though it's the only node. All right. So now that we've done that, let's insert this new node that we've created into this main list. Even though it's a list, it's okay. We're going to say main.append child new node. Now, if I come here and refresh the page, notice we have this is some text. It's been inserted into the page. If I use the Firebug Inspector, you can see that we have a paragraph now as the last item inside this unordered list. That's not really a good idea for HTML, but for now, it's okay. Now remember I said there were two places where you could put it. You could either put it as the last child element of a node or as the previous sibling of a given node. The way to do it as the previous sibling of a given node is to use the insert before method. So let's look at this. Well, first we have to find the element that we want to insert it before. So let's say we want to insert it before B, list item 2. So we have to get list item 2 there. So I'm actually going to combine this here. We'll say, we'll just call this list item 2. And we'll just say main.children1 for now. Remember, the index is 0 based, and so we say 2 to mean 1. So now list item 2 is that B text node, or a list item. So now we'll do main.insert before. The first parameter to insert before is the new node that we want to insert. So we're going to say new node. And the second thing that we want to insert is, or the second parameter that we want to pass to insert before is what is the element that we inserted before. And in this case, that's list item 2. So now we should see that this system text should move up between A and B. And it certainly does when we refresh the page. So insert before, we want to insert this. So basically we're saying insert this new node before list item 2 in the main node. And of course, what I'm showing you, these things I'm showing you here work for any type of node. So we could be inserting a new text node into a series of text nodes inside of a paragraph or something like that. Now let's talk about removing nodes from the DOM. So if we want to remove a node from the DOM, it's a bit trickier than adding it because we need to know about the node's parent. So if we had list item 2 like we had a moment ago, let's create that variable again. We can just say main.children1. If we want to remove that element, we need to know about its parent, which we do know. So we can say main.remove child list item 2. And now if I reload this page, you'll see that B is gone and we just have A and C. It can sometimes be a pain to have to find the parent node for an element and then find its child node, the one that we want to remove. Then there's no reason to save that to a variable. So a lot of time what you'll see is someone just do this. List item 2 dot parent node dot remove child list item 2, and that works just as well. So we find the element we want to remove, get its parent node, and just call remove child off the parent node property. If I refresh that, you'll see that we still have B as missing. So there you go. There's another useful method you might want to use, and that's replace child. So let's replace that list item 2 with a new one. But first we have to create it. So we'll say new node equals document dot create element. It's going to be a list item. We'll say the new text is going to be document dot create text node. We're going to call it D. Give it the text D. Good. So now we have new node dot append child new text, and then we're going to say main dot replace child, and we want to first we want to tell it what the new element is. So we're going to say new node. What do we want to replace? List item 2. So let's see if this works. If this works, B should change to D. Indeed it works. There we go. ADC. All right. So now that we've talked about adding and removing DOM nodes, let's talk about modifying them. So there are three main actions we can perform on an individual node. We could change its attributes, like its ID, its class, its rel attribute, that kind of thing. We could change its style, like its CSS styling, or we could change its event handlers. So let's start with attributes. We know this ID already has, or this unordered list already has an ID of main. Let's say we wanted to add a class to it. So for example, let's say we had a style element up here, and let's just create a class called warning, and we just want to set the color of the text with the class of warning to red. So very simple, but currently nothing has that class, so nothing's showing up as red. So what we want to do is add the class of warning to main. Well, it's pretty simple to do. All we have to do is say main.set attribute class to warning. Now if we refresh the page, you'll see that the unordered list is now colored red. And if I go here to the HTML tab and we look at it, you'll see that the unordered list with the ID of main has a class of warning. It's really that simple. There's also the get attribute. For example, I could say console.log main.get attribute class. Just like that. I need an extra quote there. And now if I go to the console here and refresh the page, you can see we have warning put out because that's the class attribute. If you're setting the ID in class, though, there are some shorthands you could use. We can say main.id to see what the ID for that main element is, or main.id new ID, or whatever to set the ID. So if I do that, you'll see here, and I refresh the page, that this has now been changed to the ID is now the new ID. We can also do the same thing with main.className. I should mention, though, that if I set class name here to, say, blue, notice the text does not show up as black, because as you'll see, the class has been changed to blue. If we want to have multiple classes, we actually have to put them in like that. We can't assign one at a time. We'd have to say blue and warning as multiple classes. And now you can see that it has class warning. Same thing goes for when using the normal set attribute to set the class. This shorthand notation is the way to go when you're setting style as well. So now that we have our main attribute, our main element here, let's set some style on it. So we can say main.style dot, well, let's say border equals 1 pixel solid red. And now you can see there we've styled that border there. We can say main.style dot, and pretty much any CSS property that you wish. We can say background color equals green. And whoops, it's green. There you go. The thing to note is that where in CSS you would use a dash and a lowercase, JavaScript takes out the dash and changes that to an uppercase value. This is called camel case. And so anywhere where there's a dash, or remove the dash and change the following letter to an uppercase value. The other important thing to notice here is that all of these are strings. So if we were going to do something like main.style dot border bottom width, I wouldn't put 10 as a number like that. That wouldn't do what I want. What I need to do is make this a string and say 10 pixels. Then I'll get my thick bottom border as I'm expecting. So they're all strings. And I'll mention one more thing. When you're working with main.style here, what you're working with is the inline style element. So you see here we're actually adding these things to the inline style. We're not working with the CSS. So you can't use this to get a style that you haven't already set via the inline style, or something that isn't in the inline styling element. All right. Let's move on to the last section of this chapter, the last section of this book, and that is events. What is an event? Simply put, it's when something happens to one of the elements in the DOM. For example, the page loads, that's an event. An element was clicked, that's an event. A mouse moves over a given element, that's an event too. When something like this happens, you probably want to do something. And so we're going to see how we can do that. Now, I've included a link to a comprehensive list of all the events available in the book. A few of the more popular ones are click, mouse over, mouse out, key press, load, submit, these kind of things. So there are really two categories of events. One are the things that a user does, for example, clicking or pressing a key. The other things are things that the browser fires when something happens. For example, when the page loads, the browser fires the page load event. Or when the user clicks a submit button, the submit event occurs. Although there's the click button, there's the click event for the button, and then there's the submit event for the button. So let's talk about event handlers then. An event handler is, or an event listener, is basically what you wire up to say, execute this function when a given event is occurred. So let's see how this works. So let's create a function called welcome user. Notice it takes a parameter that I'm calling EVT. We're not going to be discussing the event object in this book because that gets a bit beyond our scope. However, when an event occurs and it passes and it calls a function, because that function's been wired up by an event handler as we're about to do, it passes an event object to that function, unless you're in Internet Explorer. However, that's a bit beyond the scope of our book right now. There's many great resources for that online, though, that you can find just by searching for JavaScript events. Okay, so let's just have this function alert or hello there for now. Right? And now what we want to do is say main.add event listener. And this function takes three parameters. The first one is the event. So we're going to say click. So we're waiting for the click event on the main element that we have there. What do we do when the user clicks on that? Well, we could either put an anonymous function in here, or we can use the welcome user function, as we've just done there. And the third one is false, and we'll come back to what that means in a minute. But right now, let's see if this works. So if I refresh the page, I'm going to click on the main element, and I get the alert, hello there. Click, hello there. Click, hello there. So we can see that our event listener is working. Basically, all we have to do is use the method on the given element, add event listener, put the event name, the function name, and then we have this value false. Why are we doing false? This final parameter decides whether to use capturing or bubbling. This requires a short discussion on the difference between capturing and bubbling. I'll just start by saying that Internet Explorer 8 and below, so 6, 7, and 8, only support bubbling, not capturing. Internet Explorer 9 does support capturing. So you're probably going to use bubbling 99% of the time, which is what we have here, where we say false. So let's look at this. We have an unordered list with list items inside of them. When I click a list item here, I'm clicking the list item, but I'm also clicking the unordered list that these list items are in. And I'm also clicking the body element too, right? So what happens if, let's say, both the unordered list and both the unordered list and a list item itself have event handlers waiting for a click event? I've just clicked both at the same time. Which one should execute first? That's what capturing and bubbling is all about. The DOM standard says that the event should capture first and bubble second. Capturing is when the event starts at the highest element and works its way down. So the event will fire first on the unordered list, and then it will fire, or will first of all fire on the body, then it will fire on the unordered list, then it will fire on the list item. Once it reaches the bottom, so in this case that would be the list item, it then bubbles, which means it goes back to the top. So it would execute or fire again on the list item, fire again on the unordered list, and fire again on the body. Now, realize when I say fire, I'm not saying that we necessarily have something wired up. I'm saying it will go through each of those and say, this event is happening, do you have something to do? And if you say yes, it'll execute that function. So when I say false, I'm saying when I put false here, I'm saying I want to execute this function on the bubbling stage. So when I have so let's see, main is our unordered list here. So when I click a list item here and I get hello there, we start by capturing. So the body first receives the event. I don't have any listeners on the body, so it's ignored. Unordered list is where it comes to next. I do have a listener for unordered list, but I say I want it in the bubbling stage, not the capture stage, so it's ignored. Moves down the tree further to the list item that I clicked specifically. I don't have any listeners on there, so it doesn't do anything. It executes again on the list item for bubbling, doesn't do anything there. We come back up to the unordered list. Now I have something because I want to execute on the bubbling stage, I said. We're bubbling up now, so I execute the function, welcome user. Once that finishes, it goes on and bubbles up to the body where it does its final firing. Is there anything to check for? No, so we're good. And the event is over. So IE before version 9 doesn't support bubbling. So you'll probably want to use false, which is fine. Usually it doesn't matter too much. However, bubbling isn't the only thing that IE doesn't support before version 9. It also doesn't support this syntax for adding events. I don't have access to IE right now on this computer, so I can't really show you what it will work, how it will work. But if you go into the DOM example, if you open the example 5.14 file, you'll find what the code I'm about to show you here. And if you can open IE, you'll see that it will work. First of all, you can open the example that we've just been looking at, for example 5.13, and in IE, see that it will not work. And now what we need to work is main.attach event is what we want. For IE, we want, they always add the word on to the beginning of each event. So on click, on load, on submit, on key press, something like that. Right? So we would want to say use the attach event function because that's what IE has. And I'll show you how to make this versatile for both browsers in a minute here. On click, and then we just pass the function name. Welcome user. So it's a bit simpler because we don't have the bubbling, although we have to add that word on. All right. And so if we had IE, this is what we would use to wire up our events in IE. But before we look at cross-browser event handling, let's talk about removing events. So if you ever want to remove event, we could say remove event listener, click, welcome user, and false. So now it finds the event that we wired up here and will disconnect it so that now, see, we wire it up and then we disconnect it. So now when I reload this page, if I click this, you'll see I don't get anything because it's been removed there. In IE, the IE equivalent of this is main.detach event. And we would still pass on click and welcome user, so that it knows which event and which function for that event to undo. So now let's talk about this cross-browser event stuff that I was mentioning. We have an IE event model and a every other browser that supports the proper thing event model. What do we do to support them both? Well, we write a function, of course. So this function is, we're going to call it add event. And it's going to take an element, it's going to take a type of event, and it's going to take the function that we want. So what we're going to do first is see if element has dot add event listener. So does the element have the add event listener function? If it does, we're going to use it. So we'll say element add event listener type function and false, right? It's that simple. Else element dot, if it doesn't have add event listener, we'll assume we're in IE and we can do attach event. And we have to add that on prefix, on type, and then we just pass in the function. It's that simple. So now let's make sure this works. We can say add event. Well, actually, here's what we're going to use it for. Remember way back at the beginning where I told you that we need to put our scripts at the bottom of the page, right below, right above the closing body tag, so that when the JavaScript loads, if it has to do anything to the DOM, to the HTML elements, it will wait until the DOM has loaded, and then it can execute the script. I said that if you know how to write the code so that it will wait until the DOM has loaded, then you can do it that way and you can put it wherever you want. This is the key here. We need to wait for the page load event. So the window will execute the load event when the DOM is finished loading. That's what we're waiting for. So let's try our add event here. We're going to say on the window, we're waiting for the load event, and we want, when it finishes loading, we can just pass in a function here, and we can just alert do something, right? So now this event should occur. We're using our function here, so this should work, right? We don't need these things anymore. So I should be able to refresh the page, and once the page is finished loading, we'll get that alert, which we'll use our add event function here. So let's see if this works. Nope, we have a problem. Let's see, can I get an error message here? Element.attach event is not a function. Okay, so let's debug this. Add event, element, type in a function. That's good. So if element.add event listener, I'm just leaving a letter E out there. So notice what was happening. I misspelled add event listener, and so it was saying it can't find that. So it assumes we're in IE and goes on to do that. All right, so now that I have those typos fixed, this should work. I can kill this page. If I refresh the page, and notice there you go, we get our do something when the page loads. There we go. So you can check out Appendix A in the book if you'd like some further resources on using events. Well, as you can see, the DOM is occasionally confusing. We've had to jump over a few text nodes. IE has its own mind about events and more. And we haven't even talked about AJAX, or the browser object model, which is very similar to the document object model, but not the same thing. So does all this mean that you are doomed to write awkward code for the browser for the rest of your life? Not really, because there are plenty of JavaScript libraries out there that allow you to do this. You've heard of jQuery or MooTools or YUI or Dojo. The point in all these is to make what we've been doing, what I've just been showing you in this chapter, much easier. I'll also be quick to mention that a JavaScript framework is much simpler to use, but you should really understand what it's doing. If you really understand what JavaScript, how JavaScript works, not only will you be able to use your JavaScript libraries more intelligently, you'll be able to know when you don't need a JavaScript library, because sometimes a JavaScript library is overkill. Well, we've made it to the end of this series of screencasts. I hope you've enjoyed them. If you have any questions, I would love for you to get in touch with me. In the About the Author section at the end of this book, you can find my Twitter address and also the address to my personal site where you can get my email address. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the book, on the screencast. Did you find that you were able to learn from them? If you were, I'd love to hear about it. If you found there was a problem with them, let me know. Really like to hear any feedback you have about getting good with JavaScript. Thanks so much for watching.